The cold did not arrive gently in the high country. It never did. It came the way it always came in the early 19th century Rockies, without warning, without mercy, and without concern for how hard a man had worked to prepare. One evening the sky was clear and quiet. By morning, the wind had teeth. By nightfall, it was already deciding who would make it to spring. Men liked to say they were ready. They always said that in October. But winter had a way of exposing the lie. Thin-walled cabins crouched in the valleys like paper boxes, smoke clawing out of their chimneys as if the fire inside were trying to escape. Woodpiles shrank faster than anyone admitted. Axes rang from dawn to dusk. Not because men wanted warmth, but because stopping meant freezing. Out here, heat was not comfort. Heat was time. Heat was survival. And the cold did not negotiate. It slipped through every crack in green lumber. It rode the wind straight through poorly chinked walls. It settled into floors, climbed up bed frames, and waited patiently for fires to fade at 3 in the morning, when no one wanted to wake. That was when it took people. Elias Crowe understood this kind of cold. He had learned it long before the Rockies. Long before the traplines, the snow-choked passes, and the lonely cabins scattered miles apart. He had learned it as a boy, in a place where winter lasted longer than patience and mistakes were remembered in graves. Now, standing outside his cabin as the first real cold of the season pressed down from the peaks, Elias said nothing. He did not curse the wind. He did not hurry. He only placed one bare hand against the outer wall of his cabin and waited. The boards were already cold. Not frozen, yet, but cold enough to speak clearly. Thin wood. Fast loss. He stepped back, watching the way the wind bent the grass and curled snow into the low spots. Somewhere down the valley, a hammer rang against wood. Someone was still building. Someone else was already too late. Elias had seen this before. Every winter followed the same pattern. Men rushed to finish cabins with walls barely thicker than a handspan. They told themselves they would burn more wood if it got bad. They believed fire could solve anything. Fire could not fix a bad wall. A stove could roar red hot and still lose the fight if the wind was allowed to carry heat away faster than it was made. Elias had watched men feed fires until their woodpiles vanished, and then feed fence rails, furniture, anything that would burn. He had watched women sleep in coats. Children wake with stiff fingers. Water buckets glaze with ice inside heated rooms. The cold did not care how brave a man thought he was. Elias turned toward his cabin. Not large, not impressive, not new. It was built the way most were built. That was the problem. He did not plan to rebuild it. Instead, he planned to bury it. Not in earth. Not in snow. In thickness. Neighbors had already noticed. They always did. They watched from horseback or from half-finished doorways as Elias hauled and stacked materials with deliberate patience. Too much patience, some said. Too much effort for a wall that already stood. They shook their heads. "You can't outwork winter," one man had muttered. Elias never argued. He had learned long ago that men laughed most confidently right before winter corrected them. What he was doing looked foolish at a glance. Excessive. Wasteful. Almost superstitious. Why reinforce what was already standing? Why add weight, bulk time? Because Elias Crowe did not measure winter the way other men did. He measured it by the longest night in January, by the moment the fire went low before dawn, by how long warmth stayed after the last log was added. And by those measures, most cabins failed. He crouched and brushed frost from the ground near his foundation, studying how the wind moved at ankle height. Cold always entered low first. It climbed slowly, patiently, until the entire room belonged to it. Inside the cabin, the stove sat cold and dark. Elias had not lit it yet, not because he feared the cold, but because he respected it. Fire wasted early was fire missing later. He would light it when the walls were ready. Because Elias understood something many frontier builders did not. Winter was not beaten by stronger fires. It was beaten by making fires unnecessary. The trick was not heat. The trick was keeping heat from leaving. As dusk settled over the valley, smoke rose from other chimneys, thick. Desperate columns already working too hard. Elias watched them for a long moment, then turned back to his work. The season had begun, and soon, the cold would decide who had built for comfort and who had built for survival. By mid-October, the laughter had started. It carried easily across the valley, light, confident, unbothered by the coming winter. Men laughed best when the sun was still warm at midday and the real cold felt far away. That was when bad decisions sounded reasonable. Elias Crowe became the subject of that laughter without ever asking for attention. While others hurried to finish cabins or stack firewood as fast as their backs allowed, Elias moved differently. He worked slower, not lazy measured. He hauled materials that made no sense to anyone watching. He stacked them where no one else would have bothered. Around an already standing cabin. From a distance, it looked like confusion. From up close, it looked like waste. "You planning to live inside a barn now?" Someone called from horseback one morning. Another laughed. "Winter's bad, Elias, but it ain't bury your house bad." Elias did not answer. He rarely did. He had learned something important over years spent in places where help never arrived on time. Explaining yourself too early only invited interference. Let people talk. Let them assume. Most frontier men followed the same logic when building. Put up 4 walls as quickly as possible. Thin boards. Tight corners. Fix the rest later. If winter turned ugly, they would burn more wood. If the wind slipped through cracks, they would stuff rags or mud where they could reach. Speed mattered. Cost mattered. Appearances mattered. Preparation did not, at least not until January. Elias's cabin stood finished, but untouched by final judgment. No stove roaring. No smoke curling upward. While others burned early season wood to chase off the chill, Elias was still working on the outside. That alone unsettled people. Frontier life had rules, even if no one admitted it. One of those rules was this: once your cabin stood, you stopped touching it. To keep building after completion felt like admitting failure. Men noticed Elias stacking material against the walls, measuring, adjusting, stepping back to observe the wind. They noticed he worked heavier on the north and west sides, the directions winter favored when it wanted to kill. "Overthinking it," one neighbor said. "Waste of good material," said another. "Fire hazard," warned a third. That last comment carried weight. Everyone knew the stories. Cabins burned to the ground because someone stacked the wrong thing too close to heat. Entire families lost because one spark landed where it shouldn't have. Fire was both savior and executioner on the frontier. But Elias Crowe was not careless. He left clear space where heat would pass. He measured distance from metal to fiber with a patience that annoyed men who preferred instincts over numbers. He elevated materials off the soil. Moisture killed structures long before flames did. Still, none of that was obvious from a passing glance. What people saw was a man spending extra effort where none seemed required. A man reinforcing a shelter that already existed. A man acting as though winter had already arrived, even while children still ran without coats. Frontier communities were small, and judgment traveled fast. "He thinks he knows something the rest of us don't," someone said at the trading post. "Or he's afraid," another replied. Fear carried shame back then. To prepare too much was to admit doubt in your own strength. Men prided themselves on enduring hardship, not avoiding it. Elias never corrected them, because fear had nothing to do with it. He had buried friends in frozen ground before. He had seen cabins fail not because men were weak, but because they trusted walls that had never been tested. He remembered nights when fire burned bright, yet frost still crept across the floor. Nights when the difference between life and death came down to how fast heat escaped once the flames settled. So he kept stacking, layer by layer, thickness over speed, silence over approval. The cabin began to look strange, less like a house, more like something being fortified. Children pointed. Men joked. Horses shied at the unfamiliar shape pressing outward from familiar walls. Elias worked through it all, unmoved. He was not building for October. He was building for the morning when the fire went low and the wind did not stop. By the time the first hard frost settled into the valley and laughter faded into uneasy quiet, Elias Crowe's cabin no longer looked foolish. It looked ready. And readiness, on the frontier, was the one thing that could turn mockery into silence, if winter agreed to prove the point. Elias Crowe did not invent his idea. That was the part no one understood. What he was building had existed long before sawmills, long before frontier towns, long before anyone thought thin boards and strong fires were enough to survive a northern winter. The knowledge he carried was older than the cabin itself, and older than most of the men laughing at him. He had learned it as a boy, in a land where winter was not a season, but a condition of life. Back there, houses were not measured by how quickly they went up, but by how slowly they gave heat away. Walls were thick enough to lean against in storms. Roofs were heavy with earth, sod, or layered wood, built to hold warmth the way a clay oven holds fire. Those homes did not fight winter. They ignored it. Inside them, fires burned low and steady. Not roaring, not desperate, just enough to replace what little warmth escaped. The walls did the real work. That lesson stayed with Elias long after he crossed an ocean and followed traplines into the high country. Out here, he saw the same mistake repeated again and again. Men focused on the fire. Bigger stove, more wood, hotter burn, as if heat were something you could overpower the cold with. But Elias understood the arithmetic. Heat made minus heat lost equals survival. And most cabins lost heat faster than any stove could replace it. Wood, no matter how solid, was thin when cut into boards. An inch of timber stood little chance against moving air. Wind stripped warmth away by the second, pulling it straight through gaps too small to see. The fire worked constantly, but the wall never held its share of the burden. That was the real failure. The cold did not kill by freezing everything at once. It killed by exhaustion. It forced men to burn fuel faster than they could replace it, until something ran out, wood strength or time. Elias had seen what worked. He had seen it in earth-sheltered homes where the ground itself became insulation, in sod houses on the plains, where walls 2 feet thick stayed cool in summer and warm in winter, in cellars dug deep enough that frost never reached them. No matter how cruel the season became above, the principle was always the same. Still air. Air that could not move could not carry heat away. Trap enough of it, and the cold lost its speed. It pressed. It waited, but it could not rush inside. That was what thin walls failed to do. They allowed air to move, to slip, to steal warmth constantly. Elias also knew something else, something most men overlooked because it wasn't dramatic. Thickness slowed time. Thick walls warmed slowly, yes. But once warm, they cooled just as slowly. The fire did not need to roar all night. It only needed to replace what escaped, not what rushed away. That difference mattered most at 3 in the morning. He remembered nights when fires burned down to coals and the temperature inside held steady until dawn, not because the fire was strong, but because the walls were patient. Frontier builders did not lack strength or skill. What they lacked was memory. They built as though winter were short, as though help might arrive, as though fuel were endless. Elias built as though none of those things were true. Standing beside his cabin, he could already imagine how the cold would move once it arrived, how it would search for edges, how it would try to climb from the ground up, how it would probe weak points and wait for exhaustion to finish the work. So he gave it nowhere to hurry. Layer by layer, he created distance between his fire and the outside world. Not stone, not earth, but something just as effective. Countless pockets of trapped air held motionless inside dense material. The idea was simple enough to sound foolish. But simplicity had kept people alive long before cleverness ever did. Elias Crowe was not trying to outfight winter. He was trying to outlast it. And that meant building a cabin that behaved less like a shelter and more like a memory of warmth that refused to let go. Elias Crowe began with the part no one found interesting, the ground. He scraped frost-stiffened soil away from the base of his cabin and laid a low sill of stone and rough-cut planks, lifting the future wall just enough to break contact with the earth. Moisture was a quieter enemy than fire, but far more patient. Anything that wicked dampness from the soil would rot long before winter finished its work. Only after the base was right did Elias begin stacking. The first course went up slow and careful, pressed tight against the cabin but never touching it. A narrow air gap remained between old boards and new mass. An intentional pause where heat could settle instead of rushing outward. Each section was squared and leveled, not because it looked better, but because uneven walls collapsed under their own weight once snow began to load them. From the outside, it looked absurd. A finished cabin being wrapped in a second body. A house inside a wall. A man building backward. Neighbors stopped to watch. Some shook their heads. Some offered advice Elias did not need. Others warned him again about fire. That concern was not wrong. It was just misplaced. Elias respected fire too much to fear it blindly. He measured carefully around the stovepipe, leaving a clear buffer where no material could touch hot metal. He lined the passage with stone and clay, the same way blacksmiths protected wooden shops from forges. Above the roofline, the chimney rose higher than usual, capped with a simple wire screen to catch stray sparks before they could drift back down. Fire was only dangerous when it was allowed to forget its boundaries. The wall itself grew thicker as it rose. On the southern side, where the sun still offered some help, the layer remained substantial but restrained. On the north and west, where winter struck hardest, Elias added more. Thickness was not about symmetry. It was about pressure. Wind had habits. So did cold. By the time the wall reached the eaves, it measured nearly 2 feet deep in the most exposed places. From the valley, the cabin now looked like something half-buried, half-armored. Less a home than a fort built for a siege no one else believed would come. What the neighbors could not see was what mattered most. Inside that wall were thousands of tiny, motionless spaces, air trapped so completely it could not flee. Each pocket slowed the escape of heat. Together, they formed a barrier no single fire could overpower and no wind could rush through. The wall did not create warmth. It kept warmth from running away. Elias worked through late afternoons, even as temperatures dropped and daylight shortened. His hands stiffened, but he did not rush. Rushing created gaps. Gaps became failures. Failures became funerals. When the wall was finally complete, he topped it with a simple covering to shed water and snow, sloped just enough to guide melt away from the structure. Nothing fancy. Nothing permanent. Winter demanded function, not pride. At last, he stepped back. The cabin stood quiet inside its strange new shell. No fire burned yet. No smoke rose. The structure waited, heavy and still, like an animal conserving energy before a long winter. Someone passing on horseback muttered, "That thing'll never breathe." Elias almost smiled. That was the point. A good wall did not breathe in winter. It held its breath and kept everything inside alive. Only then did Elias Crowe step inside and light the stove. The fire caught slowly, warming not just the air, but the wall itself. It would take time. Thick walls always did. But Elias understood patience better than most. Because once that wall learned the shape of warmth, it would remember it. And winter would find nothing inside that it could steal quickly. The storm did not announce itself. There was no gradual warning, no courteous shift in the weather. One evening the air grew unnaturally still, as if the land itself were holding its breath. By dawn, the mountains had vanished behind a wall of white, and the wind came screaming down the valleys with nothing left to lose. This was the kind of storm old trappers remembered for the rest of their lives. Arctic air spilled south in a single, merciless sweep. Temperatures collapsed within hours. Snow did not fall so much as it was driven, scoured across the ground, packed into drifts that erased trails and swallowed fences. By nightfall, the cold was no longer approaching. It had arrived. In cabins scattered across the high country, fires were lit early and fed hard. Stoves glowed red, iron ticking and groaning under the strain. Men chopped wood by lantern light, hands numb, breath freezing in beards before it could fade. Every chimney poured smoke like a signal flare of desperation. Inside those thin-walled shelters, the fight began immediately. Heat gathered near the stove, but fled the moment it reached the walls. Cold crept up from the floorboards and settled into corners where no flame could reach. Thermometers, if a family owned one, clung stubbornly to the low 30s, sometimes less, no matter how much fuel vanished into the fire. Water buckets skimmed over with ice by morning. Nailheads bloomed with frost. Children slept wrapped in coats, their breathing shallow, waking often as the cold pressed in through the night. Fire fought bravely. Fire was losing. And then there was Elias Crowe's cabin. From the outside, it looked unchanged by the chaos, half-buried, thick-walled quiet. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, steady ribbon, not the frantic plume of a stove being forced beyond its limits. Inside, the difference was not dramatic. It was better than dramatic. The temperature held. Not hot, not stifling, just steady. Warm enough that hands stayed loose. Warm enough that water remained liquid. Warm enough that sleep came without shivering. While other men fed their fires every hour, Elias let his burn low and slow. The heat had nowhere to rush. It settled into the wall, soaked into the trapped air, and stayed. That was the trick no one else had prepared for. Winter was not a single moment of cold. It was endurance. It was nights stacked on nights. Storms piled on storms, each one draining fuel, strength, and patience. In a thin cabin, every hour demanded payment. In Elias's cabin, time stretched. The wall absorbed the day's heat and gave it back slowly through the night. When the fire sank to coals at 3 in the morning, the hour winter loved most, the temperature barely moved. By dawn, the cabin still held warmth others had lost before midnight. Outside, the storm raged without pause. Drifts climbed past windows. Wind howled hard enough to shake roofs. Somewhere in the dark, a tree snapped under ice load and vanished beneath the snow. Elias woke once, rose, added a single split log, and returned to bed. Elsewhere, men never slept. By the second night, wood piles shrank alarmingly. Axes rang again, even in the storm, because stopping meant surrender. Every cabin faced the same brutal math. Burn faster or freeze. Elias faced a different equation. He had not built a stronger fire. He had built a place where fire did not have to fight alone. As the storm pressed harder, the difference between cabins grew unmistakable. Not by sight, by silence. Where other homes crackled, groaned, and hissed under strain, Elias Crowe's cabin simply endured. The cold could press. The wind could scream. But trapped behind thick walls and still air, winter had lost its speed. And for the first time, the valley was learning that survival was not about how fiercely you burned, but about how little you let the heat escape once it was made. By the third morning of the storm, the valley had gone quiet in a way that meant trouble. Smoke still rose from chimneys, but it no longer climbed straight. It lay low, pressed flat by the cold, drifting sideways like a warning. The kind of smoke that told you fires were being fed hard and still losing ground. Elias Crowe noticed it as he stepped outside to knock snow from the doorframe. He felt the air with his face, measuring it the way a sailor reads wind. This was no passing blow. The cold had settled in. It intended to stay. Not far away, another cabin was failing. The signs were always the same. Too much smoke. Too little movement. No children's noise. No one chopping wood anymore because there was no strength left to swing an axe. By mid-morning, a figure appeared through the drifting snow. A man on foot, head down, shoulders hunched against the wind. He moved slowly, as if every step had to be negotiated. Behind him, bundled awkwardly against his chest, was a child wrapped in blankets already stiff with frost. Elias did not wait for a knock. He opened the door before the man reached it, and the difference in temperature struck like a physical thing. Warm air spilled out, fogging the man's vision and stealing his breath more effectively than the cold ever had. "Bring him inside," Elias said. No questions. No judgment. Inside the cabin, the quiet was different from other homes in winter. There was no frantic feeding of the stove. No hissing kettle left too close to the fire out of fear it might freeze. The warmth was even, patient. Elias laid the child near the stove, not close enough to shock the cold from his body, but near enough for steady recovery. He wrapped him in warmed blankets and waited. The man's hands shook as he held a cup Elias pressed into them. His lips were blue. His eyes darted to the walls, then the floor, as if trying to understand why this cabin felt so different from his own. "How?" he finally asked. Elias shrugged. "The fire's doing what it should. The walls are doing the rest." There was no triumph in his voice, only certainty. The man spoke quietly then, ashamed. About feeding the stove all night. About running out of dry wood. About waking to a room colder than the outside air. About a child who would not stop shivering. None of it surprised Elias. He had seen this winter before. Outside, the storm continued without mercy. But inside, time slowed. The child's breathing eased. Color returned slowly. The way it always did when cold was replaced with patience instead of panic. By afternoon, another knock came. Then another. Men did not come asking for advice. They came asking for warmth. Elias opened the door every time. His cabin became a place of refuge, not because it was larger, but because it had been built for the worst day, not the average one. Families crowded inside, sitting close but not desperate. The stove burned steadily, unhurried, as if it understood its role at last. No one laughed now. No one mentioned the strange wall or the wasted effort. Pride had no place left. Only survival. That night, as the wind battered the valley and other fires roared themselves hollow, Elias Crowe sat quietly by his stove and listened to the sounds around him. Breathing. Soft conversation. The steady tick of iron cooling and warming. This was what preparation sounded like. Not heroics. Not defiance. Just knowledge applied early enough to matter. On the frontier, bravery was admired. Strength was respected. But it was understanding, quiet, uncelebrated understanding, that saved lives when winter came to collect its due. Winter loosened its grip the way it always did, reluctantly. The storms did not stop all at once. They thinned. The wind lost its edge. Days stretched just enough to remind people that time still moved forward. Snow crusted instead of drifting, and the sound of axes returned to the valley, slower now, careful. Like men relearning how to work without urgency. When the worst had passed, the valley took account of itself. Some cabins stood blackened inside from constant fires that had burned too hot for too long. Others sagged, warped by cycles of freezing and thawing. Their thin walls had never been meant to survive. Wood piles were gone. Fence rails were missing. Furniture bore the scars of desperation. But there were no graves that winter. Not near Elias Crowe's cabin. Word spread the same way it always did on the frontier, quietly, through necessity rather than pride. Men visited under the excuse of returning tools. Women came with bread, or jars, or nothing at all. They walked slowly around the thick walls, touching them with bare hands, feeling the difference long after the cold had retreated. No one called it foolish anymore. They asked questions instead. How thick? How close to the chimney? How do you keep it dry? How much fuel did you burn? Elias answered when asked. He did not preach. He did not exaggerate. He told them the numbers, because numbers were honest. Less than half the wood. No frozen nights. No emergency fires at dawn. That was enough. By late spring, the wall came down as methodically as it had gone up. Sound material was set aside. Weathered outer layers were repurposed. Nothing was wasted. Even spoiled sections returned to the land as bedding or soil cover. The lesson remained. When summer returned and men prepared again for winter, as they always said they would do better next time, the preparations looked different. Cabins gained thickness where they had been naked before. Foundations were raised. Gaps were closed. The wind was considered, not ignored. The idea spread outward, not as a theory, but as a practice. A man on the frontier did not need proof written in books. He needed proof that kept his children alive. By the following autumn, no one laughed when walls grew thicker than tradition demanded. No one mocked the man who worked longer before winter arrived. Excess had revealed itself as foresight. Elias Crowe returned to his quiet routines. Trapping, repairing, watching the weather with the same calm patience he always had. He never claimed credit. He never told the story himself. Others told it for him. They told it when they stacked materials higher than before, when they banked walls deeper, when they burned less wood and slept more. The frontier did not change its mind easily, but when it did, it remembered. And from that winter on, the valley understood something it had missed for too long. Survival was not about enduring suffering. It was about removing it before it arrived. The laughter never returned. Only thicker walls did. Years later, when people spoke of that winter, they rarely talked about the storm itself. They talked about what it revealed. On the frontier, hardship was expected. Men accepted cold, hunger, and exhaustion as part of the price of living far from towns and comforts. Suffering had become so familiar that few questioned whether it was always necessary. Elias Crowe did. He never claimed to be smarter than anyone else. He never spoke of invention or brilliance. What he practiced was something older and quieter, attention. He watched how heat moved. He noticed how wind behaved. He remembered what worked long before lumber was cheap and fuel was taken for granted. Most men asked the wrong question when building a cabin. They asked, will this stand? Elias asked something else entirely. What happens at 3 in the morning when the fire is low and the wind has not stopped? That single question changed everything. His wall was not impressive because it was thick. It mattered because it bought time. Time to sleep. Time to think. Time to wake up warm enough to face the day instead of merely surviving it. On the frontier, that difference was everything. Winter did not reward effort. It rewarded preparation. It did not care how strong a man was, how hard he worked, or how bravely he endured discomfort. It only responded to physics, patience, and respect. The lesson Elias left behind was never written down. It did not need to be. Build for the worst day, not the average one. Don't fight nature where you can outthink it. And never mistake suffering for strength. Those truths outlived the cabin. They traveled with the people who learned them, shaping thicker walls, quieter winters, and fewer desperate fires burning through the night. Today, the materials may be different, the tools more refined, but the principle remains unchanged. Warmth is not something you chase. It is something you protect. And on the frontier, as in life, the people who survive longest are rarely the loudest or the strongest. They are the ones who understand what to build before the storm arrives.